Thanks, Paolo, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have you this morning or this afternoon or evening, depending on where you're coming in from around the world today. So my name's Phil Carter. As Paolo said, I teach a course for Reforge, and I've spent the majority of my 15-year career working with tech companies, primarily consumer companies, and I've worked with a lot of subscription businesses. And as I've seen a number of consumer subscription apps, both internally as a growth and product leader and now externally as a growth advisor, struggle with many of the same challenges around user acquisition, subscriber conversion, monetization. I've developed this framework that I call the subscription value loop. It's the unifying framework to my Reforge course. It's also a topic that I've written about quite a bit on my Substack. And confidentially, I have a guest post coming out through Lenny's newsletter in the next week or two that will go into a lot more detail on this. But you all are getting a sneak peek. So we're going to jump into it today. I'll give you all a little bit more background on me before we get started. So I'm currently the founder at Elemental Growth. It's a growth advising agency for seed to Series C consumer subscription businesses. I'm also an angel investor, and so I do some investing on the side. Prior to that, I spent the last 7 years leading product and growth teams at $3 billion plus companies, most recently at Fair, where I led international category and upmarket expansion. Prior to that, I spent almost 4 years at Quizlet, which is one of the top education consumer subscription businesses in the world. Was a senior director of growth there, leading everything from top of funnel user acquisition to subscriber conversion and retention at the bottom of the funnel. Before that, I was a director of product at Ibotta here in Denver, which is where I'm coming to you from today. And then prior to that, I spent a few years in venture capital at Trinity Ventures, investing in early stage consumer business models. This was 2013 to 2015, so right around the time that consumer mobile apps were really starting to hit their stride, and you were starting to see more and more of these big venture outcomes. And so I've been living in the world of consumer mobile for a long time now, and love these business models. But they are challenging. They do have some headwinds that they often face. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Here's our agenda. So we're going to spend 5 minutes up front on the problem, which is that consumer subscription apps are easy to launch, but hard to scale. Then we'll get into the subscription value loop framework, which is the proprietary framework I've developed for how to think about growing these businesses. And then we'll get into a little bit more actionable solutions. So how to quantify your loop, identifying some of your biggest growth opportunities using a tool that I've developed called the subscription value loop calculator, and then applying those specific strategies and tactics to actually accelerate the growth of your business. I'm hoping to get through that in the next 20 to 25 minutes so that we can leave plenty of time for Q&A. If you do have questions, I told Paolo I'd love to make this interactive and as much of a discussion as possible. So please don't hold back on asking your questions in the chat as we go. And if Paolo sees a particularly good one, he may jump in and we can sort of make it interactive as we go. All right, so let's start with the problem. And that is that consumer subscription apps are relatively easy to launch, but hard to scale. And when I say relatively, like any tech company is difficult to build. So please don't hear me as saying, oh, it's easy to just go out and build a mobile app. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is relative to a lot of more complex business models like B2B SaaS or marketplaces, consumer subscription apps tend to be a little bit easier to get to market, and I'll explain why in a moment. So the subscription economy has expanded rapidly. There are now more than a dozen major categories of mobile subscription apps. Some of the big ones are health and fitness, productivity, education, and then you've got a longer tail of travel and utilities and many others. And there haven't been too many major success stories yet. In the guest post that I'm doing for Lenny's newsletter, I talk about there have been less than 50 total consumer subscription businesses to reach billion-dollar plus valuations. That's across both public and private markets. And there have been less than 10 that are publicly traded with valuations north of $10 billion. So there have only been so many major outcomes. But there have been some really big ones. Duolingo is a recent success story. You've got Spotify, Netflix, and obviously a number of others. But even those companies have seen their ups and downs. And so to get into why we see that, I alluded to this before, relative to many other business models, consumer subscription apps can generally launch faster with less capital. It's not always the case, but as a rule of thumb, that's generally what you see. And there are a few reasons for that. So number one, most of these companies don't require sales teams, and they have very fast purchase cycles. They don't have to deal with complex marketplace dynamics. Every once in a while, you'll have a consumer subscription app that's a two-sided marketplace, but it's pretty unusual. They have low marginal cost of serving additional subscribers in most cases. They have high gross margins, and those generally improve as the company scales. And then finally, they can leverage app stores, the Apple and Google Play app stores, for global distribution, for payments, and for turnkey support tools. And so all of these are advantages that make it relatively easy for consumer subscription apps to get off the ground. But then it gets tricky. And I'm not the only person who's written on this. Casey Winters has a great article on why consumer subscription is hard. And he talks about how you have these three fundamental challenges, right? Number one, finding users is hard. And when I say that, what I mean is there are certainly examples of apps like Quizlet or Strava or AllTrails that have hugely benefited from organic word of mouth, in some cases from SEO. But a lot of these consumer subscription businesses are overly reliant on paid user acquisition through channels that are increasingly saturated. I'm talking about channels like Facebook, Instagram, Google. And as these channels get more and more saturated, customer acquisition costs go up. Apple made things even more difficult a few years ago when they launched app tracking transparency restrictions that make attribution for paid ad spend much more difficult. And so that has rendered paid acquisition even less efficient. And so finding users is hard, and it's getting harder. Number two, keeping users is hard. So there's plenty of literature out there on consumer subscription retention benchmarks and how those compare to B2B SaaS. And I'm going to get into some of the specific data on the next couple slides. But as you might imagine, consumers are fickle. There are a lot of substitute products out there. And so you don't see the same degree of long-term subscriber retention in consumer that you see in prosumer SaaS and especially in enterprise SaaS. And then the third thing is monetizing users is hard. So ARPU, average revenue per user, tends to be much lower for consumer than it does for B2B business models. And it's harder to expand, right? You don't have the land and expand dynamics that you have with an enterprise account, where you might enter with a certain number of seats, but then as you prove yourself as a product, you're able to sell more seats and expand the average contract value of your retained accounts. And that helps to offset the churn of accounts that go away. And so it's just hard to monetize these users over the long run. And all of these make scaling difficult, easy to launch, but hard to scale. And so don't just take my word for it. There's data out there to support this. So there are a number of data sources you can look at: Recurly, Adaptee. There are a few others out there. My favorite personally is RevenueCat. They just came out a few months ago with their State of Subscription Apps report for 2024. And it compiles data from over 30,000 consumer subscription apps, accounting for more than 290 million subscribers and billions of dollars in subscription revenue. So it's a fairly reliable, robust data set. And what you can see here, I haven't pulled all of the important consumer subscription metrics, but I've pulled a few of the most critical ones. And the numbers are pretty telling. So even looking at top quartile apps, so apps in the 75th percentile, these apps are converting less than 6% of installs into subscriptions. And then they are losing just over half of their annual subscribers after the first year and over half of their monthly subscribers after 3 months. And so that's difficult, right? Like building a venture scale sustainable business, particularly one that's going to be heavily reliant on paid acquisition as it scales, is not easy with those numbers. The good news is, as you get into the very top 5% of apps, so 95th percentile subscription apps, do have the numbers to support venture scale businesses. The numbers here look meaningfully different. So you've got install to paid conversion rates over 17%. You've got 3 month monthly retention north of 60%, and then 1 year annual retention well north of 60% as well. And so this starts to look like the metrics you would want to see as an investor to believe, okay, I can put my money into a product like this, and maybe it can be the next Duolingo or it can be the next Spotify. Okay, so that's the context. What are these apps doing differently? Like, how are these apps able to succeed where so many others either fail or, they just hit a ceiling around 5 million, 10 million in ARR? That's what we're going to spend the next section talking about. And Paolo, feel free to jump in at any point if you have any questions you want me to answer, but otherwise I will keep charging ahead here.
We had a specific question actually on back to the RevenueCat data. Do you know what the denominator is for the trial start date?
For trial start rate?
Yeah.
These are all based off of installs. And so this is an important caveat, which is different subscription businesses rely more heavily on mobile versus web conversion. Obviously, some subscriptions don't even have trials. It's just straight to subscriber conversion. And so, I'm trying to apply a general set of numbers across an ecosystem that is a bit more nuanced, just to illustrate the point. But the numbers here, trial start rate, trial conversion rate, and install to paid conversion rate. Trial start rate times trial conversion rate essentially is install to paid conversion rate. And so all of these are based off of installs as a denominator.
Great. That was the only question so far.
Great question. Awesome. Well, please keep them coming. In the meantime, I'm going to jump into the subscription value loop framework. So this is a framework that I've developed for how to think about growing consumer subscription businesses. And it came out of the nearly 4 years that I spent leading user growth and subscriptions teams at Quizlet. So the first component of this is the core value promise. And this is true of any business, right? Any business is built on a strong and compelling promise that it's giving to its customers. What makes consumer subscription particularly interesting is that there's just so much competition, right? Because these apps are easy to launch, it means that many of these app categories have gotten very crowded. And because you have a subscription business model, you need a promise that isn't just compelling, it needs to be enduring, right? If you deliver a lot of value in your first month or two, but then you hit diminishing returns, you're going to see subscribers churn, and that won't really support a successful long-term business. So the best consumer subscription apps have unique core value promises that offer enduring value. I've listed a few examples here that you probably recognize. So Spotify, listen to music you love, build playlists, discover new artists who match your taste. Duolingo, enjoy gamified study experiences with an emphasis on gamified that make language learning fun. Strava, record and share your workouts with a supportive community of athletes. You've got the kudos and the whole, if it's not on Strava, it didn't happen. And then Tinder, find, match, and connect with other attractive single people in your area and do it quickly in a single swipe and in a way that's really fun and engaging. So these are examples of compelling core value promises that are at least differentiated enough from the competition that it gives these companies a real advantage and a real moat to build on. And then the next step is a 3-step compounding subscription value loop that harnesses the power of that core value promise. And so the 3 steps here are value creation, which is building a great product that offers ongoing value to subscribers. That work is typically done by core product teams. You've got value delivery. That's delivering value through cost-efficient user acquisition, typically led by marketing, and in some cases with assistance from growth product. And then finally, value capture. This is often the most overlooked step, particularly for early stage subscription businesses that, they want to give away a lot of value for free. They want to drive organic acquisition. But you need to be able to convert enough free users into subscribers and generate enough revenue to subscribers to be able to reinvest in the business, because otherwise you don't have the resources you need to invest in product innovation and paid marketing campaigns. And that's what recycles and compounds the loop. And that work is typically led by growth product. So those are the 4 components of the subscription value loop: the core value promise, and then the 3 steps of value creation, value delivery, and value capture. Next, I thought I'd go into a brief case study on each of these steps. And this is content that I've written about on Substack. It's content that you'll hear about in my course from guest speakers that have actually worked at all 3 of these companies. So first, we'll start with value creation. And the obvious example here is Duolingo. They've been the darling of the consumer subscription world for the last couple of years after going public. I think it was in 2022. They just recently surpassed a $10 billion market cap. They fell back below that in the last few months. But they're a very valuable company. They continue to do a lot of innovative, smart things. And at the center of all that is value creation. And some of the specific tactics that Duolingo has used to great effect to create more value for their users and for their subscribers are an immersive onboarding experience. So you come into Duolingo, and within the first few minutes, they're not telling you why you should use Duolingo. They're showing you, right? You're using the product, you're learning the language, you're experiencing streaks and badges and extra rewards. So you're understanding the gamification of Duolingo that makes it different than other language learning experiences. You're seeing your lesson plan get personalized to you based off of how many responses you're getting right and wrong and the feedback that the system is getting about you as an individual language learner. And then they have demonstrated and proven efficacy. There have been academic papers written on Duolingo. It's not to say that it's a perfect substitute for taking a language course in college, but it's pretty close in a lot of cases. Like if you're a diligent Duolingo user and you use it for 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, you can get pretty good at learning a language, and you can do it in a way that's a lot less tedious. So that's Duolingo, and that's value creation. The next step is value delivery. And so for value delivery, again, this is delivering value through cost-efficient user acquisition, hopefully not being overly reliant on paid acquisition to scale. And I think a great example for value delivery is Strava. This is a product that grew virally early on, particularly within the cyclist community. Then they started to expand beyond cyclists to runners and other outdoor athletes. They've gotten a lot of benefits from users posting content on social media. Obviously, you record your workout, you want to get kudos. So you post it on the app, but in some cases, you post it on social media. And so that drives an organic flywheel. Improving paid ad efficiency. As they've gotten to a certain scale, Strava, like so many consumer subscription businesses, has had to invest more and more into paid acquisition, but they've done a better and better job of that. They've started to invest in influencer marketing campaigns on channels like TikTok and Instagram. And then they have this annual Camp Strava event where they bring together their loyal community from around the world with popular athletes for a live event that really sort of excites and galvanizes their power users. So that's Strava, that's value delivery. And then the last one, I know we saw at least one person from Match Group in the webinar. So the last example is value capture. And for this one, I'm speaking to Tinder. Ravi Mehta, who was the former chief product officer at Tinder, is one of the featured guest speakers in my course. And he talks about how Tinder has evolved over time from a single subscription tier, Tinder Plus, to 3 subscription tiers, Tinder Plus, Tinder Gold, Tinder Platinum. And they've also added additional consumable in-app purchases like boosts and super likes that complement the core premium value promises of their 3 subscription tiers. So what's important here is as a consumer subscription business, in many cases, you only have a single subscription tier, which means you can only charge one price to all of your users. You can use things like strategic discounts to try to match price to willingness to pay on the margins for users with lower willingness to pay, but there's only so far that can take you. And so what Tinder has done a remarkably good job of is coming up with these 3 different subscription tiers that each have slightly different premium value promises, sprinkling in these additional consumable in-app purchases to get even more revenue from their power users. And what all of this leads to is higher average revenue per user, higher subscriber lifetime values. That has also been important in recent years because as Tinder has gotten to be a very large company, and as they can rely less and less on the viral word of mouth that drove all their growth early on, like Strava, they needed to invest more and more money into paid acquisition campaigns. And so getting more revenue from their subscribers means their unit economics can support more spend on paid acquisition channels. And then, of course, they've done price testing and optimization in the product. That's sort of table stakes. So hopefully these 3 examples have given you a flavor for what I'm talking about when I talk about value creation, value delivery, and value capture as the 3 steps of the subscription value loop, and how it might look in practice at some of the top consumer subscription app businesses. We're getting into our third and final section next. But Paolo, any more questions from the group before I proceed?
Sure. We had a question come up from Melissa asking, how does delivering ongoing value not turn into a feature factory based product org?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think that it's tempting to draw a connection between, okay, more premium product features means more premium value means higher LTV. But in reality, at best, even if you do a good job of introducing new premium features that are actually valuable to users, you're going to hit diminishing returns, right? Because the 10th and then the 50th and then the 100th premium feature you launch, it's like the amount of incremental value you're going to get from that is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And then the second thing, which is a hidden cost of becoming a feature factory, to use your words, is your product just becomes so bloated and complex that you start to see new user conversion rates really go down because they just can't navigate the complexity of your product. Now, that's very different with prosumers and in B2B because you've got a much more considered purchase being made by a professional whose whole job is to do a good job purchasing the right software for their business. But that's not the case in consumer, right? People's attention spans are short. There are lots of cheap substitutes available in many of these app categories. And so you have to keep things simple, which means it's not necessarily about just releasing more and more and more premium features. It's about releasing the right ones and then doing a really good job of merchandising them. And to go back to the Tinder example, Tinder has 3 subscription tiers and they have 2 in-app purchases. And those different subscription tiers have different premium features underneath them. But it's not a crazy long list. And they do a really good job of explaining and packaging each of these premium value promises in a way that is relatively intuitive to their users. That's a great question. I love that one. Any others, Paolo, before I keep going?
No, you can continue.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so the last step here is, all right, we've got this framework, but a lot of times frameworks aren't very actionable. And so, I can sit up here in my ivory tower and talk about how this might work in theory, but what does it actually mean in practice? Like, how can I apply this for my own business? So I'm in the process right now of working with RevenueCat, who has the most robust and extensive data set out there that I'm aware of, to build the first version. And it's going to be an MVP, but it's the first version of what I'm calling a subscription value loop calculator that will help founders, CEOs, product marketing, and growth leaders at consumer subscription businesses to compare their performance on growth metrics that drive the subscription value loop against key benchmarks, not just overall, but in their specific country or region and in their specific app category, which is really important because these metrics vary widely by geography and by category. And so there are 5 steps you'll be able to take to do this once the tool is released over the course of the next week or 2. Number 1, identify the metrics that drive value creation, value delivery, and value capture for your business. These might be things like sign-up rate, activation rate, and long-term retention rates in value creation, cost per install, cost per trial, subscriber CAC for value delivery, and things like trial start rate, trial conversion rate, install to paid conversion rate, annual and monthly subscription prices, gross margins, and value capture. So these are the metrics I'm talking about. Number 2, you're going to calculate your company's recent performance against each metric. Generally, I recommend looking back 12 months just because if you have any sort of seasonality in your business, that'll strip out any effects of seasonality. But you want to look at recent data so that it's relevant. You're going to compare your performance against each metric versus those category and country-specific benchmarks. Then you're going to identify opportunities based on the metrics where you see the most underperformance relative to the benchmarks that are relevant to your category and region. And then finally, you can prioritize initiatives that specifically focus on growth metrics with the greatest upside potential. And there's some art to this. Like, I don't want to imply this is all just some perfect math equation where like you plug the numbers in and out comes a perfect roadmap for your product team. Obviously, you need to apply your own judgment and think about strategic value in addition to where you see upside in these benchmarks. But it can be a really valuable tool to sort of like get some X-ray vision into where you may have the most potential to accelerate growth. So here's a quick example of what this looks like. This is a completely hypothetical example, but hopefully it illustrates the point. So in this tool, once it's live, you'll be able to set your category, in this case, health and fitness. You'll be able to set your region, in this case, North America. And then you have North Star metrics, which are LTV over CAC and payback period. You've got your value creation, value delivery, and value capture metrics. And in this particular hypothetical example, you can kind of see, based off of the heat map on the right-hand side, that this company is underperforming on LTV over CAC and payback period. Okay, those are output health metrics, but why? Like digging under the surface, why are they underperforming? Well, the other red areas in the chart here are sign up and activation rates, and then subscription prices and LTV. So this company is doing a very good job of retaining subscribers once they convert them, and they're doing a good job of efficiently acquiring users and subscribers. Where they're falling down is at the top of the onboarding funnel with sign up and activation, and then they're simply not pricing their product as high as other apps in their category. So this is the type of insight that might help this hypothetical North American fitness company say, okay, let's have our growth product team go focus on improving the top of our onboarding experience, and let's run some pricing and packaging studies to figure out if we're underpriced. And so the last thing I wanted to do here before we get to Q&A is just get to some specific tactics. So you've got the subscription value loop framework as an underpinning. You've got the calculator as a tool for figuring out where you have the biggest opportunities. But once you figure out which metrics you want to move, what comes next? The guest post and landing newsletter will go into a lot more detail on this, but I'm just going to give you a sample of these today. So the first one here is a value creation tactic. That is defining an activation metric and using it to optimize your new user onboarding experience. So activation rate, you can think of as the users who reach the aha moment, which is essentially the moment where they understand why your product matters to them, divided by all users who sign up for your product. And in this case, what you want to do is brainstorm a set of different activation metrics that might be relevant. Then you can organize data that looks at, okay, for each of those activation metrics, if we were to look at our data, what is the activation rate for those various activation metrics? And then what is the long-term retention rate of users who hit the activation metric versus who don't hit it? And then ideally, what you get coming out of that is a scatter plot where you can look at the correlation, the R-squared value between activation and retention for these various activation metrics. And you want to select an activation metric that has a high R-squared value, meaning it's correlated with long-term retention, and that is simple enough and actionable enough that your team can actually use it as a powerful tool. So that's number one, activation metric. Onboarding is so important for consumer subscription apps because more than 75% of trials generally happen within a user's first session, or at least within their first 24 hours. And so this is a way to make sure that you're doing onboarding right. The second tactic is called the word of mouth coefficient. So this is a value delivery tactic. And this is a metric that I helped develop along with its creator, Youssef Baiji, who developed it coming out of Zynga and has used that at a couple of companies since then. And the idea here is word of mouth is hard to measure. It's kind of, there's so many different ways for people to talk about a product or share a product online or offline. So this is by no means a perfect tool, but the idea is you calculate the ratio of new users that you think are coming to your product through word of mouth, and you're inferring that based off of the channel they're coming in from. So social channels, referral programs, branded SEO, you can largely assume that a lot of that traffic is word of mouth driven traffic. And you divide that by your entire base of returning users who are already active on your product, and then your new users who are coming in through non-word of mouth channels, which might include paid ads or non-branded SEO. And so that gives you a ratio. And then you want to look at that ratio over time and see how it trends. And the chart here is a real analysis that I did when I was at Quizlet just before the pandemic, where we looked at our word of mouth coefficient. I've eliminated the scale here for confidentiality reasons, but you can see how Quizlet is an EdTech product. The word of mouth coefficient goes down over the summer holidays, not surprising because teachers and students are out of school. It spikes from August to September during that critical back to school window. It spikes again a couple times during the school year, during finals and other exam periods. And then when COVID hit, we saw it just plummet as schools went remote and closed down. But then we began to see it recover as schools got back on their feet and went and shifted to remote learning. And it was actually fascinating to see our word of mouth coefficient recovering in different countries at different times. And based on that, we could sort of predict as a data and analytics team, which countries were figuring out how to come back from COVID sooner rather than later with their school programs. So that's tactic number two. And then the last one here is fairly obvious. Pricing and packaging is one of the most powerful levers that any subscription business can use to improve revenue growth. There are a lot of different tools for this. There's a great Lenny's newsletter post on the ultimate guide to willingness to pay that you should check out if you haven't seen it already. But here are a couple that I like to use. So Van Westendorp is a simple one. You basically ask users 4 questions in a survey. At what price would this product start to feel too expensive, inexpensive, expensive, or too expensive? And the results to that set of survey questions gives you an acceptable price range and an optimal price point. That's the simplest way of measuring willingness to pay. It's relatively quick and easy to set up in a survey. It's not the most precise, but it's usually precise enough for consumer subscription businesses because they're in relatively established product categories. And then Conjoint goes a step further where you're actually breaking your subscription into its component features, which are called attributes. You give respondents a set of 2 or more packages that they can choose from with different features and different price points. And then the conjoint analysis actually uses all the data gathered from those responses to spit out not just overall willingness to pay, but relative importance and marginal willingness to pay for individual premium features. And this is a tool that can be really powerful, not just for overall subscription pricing, but also for things like subscription packaging and tiering. And that's it. So to wrap up here before we get to Q&A, if you remember nothing else from the webinar today, I think these are the 4 key takeaways I'd love for you to remember. Number 1, consumer subscription apps are easy to launch but hard to scale because finding, keeping, and monetizing users is harder than many other models. Number 2, the best apps overcome this by harnessing a subscription value loop with 3 steps: value creation, value delivery, and value capture. Number 3, you can use the subscription value loop calculator, which will be releasing soon, to quantify your app's performance and identify your biggest growth opportunities. And then finally, once you've identified those growth opportunities, there are several proven tactics you can turn to accelerate growth for your business. And I'll be covering those in a lot more detail in the Lenny's guest post that will launch next week or the week after. And with that, I'd love to open it up for Q&A.
Right, we have a bunch of questions here, some of which you actually already answered, like about how to experiment with pricing. And so we've got a question about delivering new features. When delivering a new feature, what steps do you take to determine whether it falls into a freemium or premium category?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like so many of these, there's an art to it and a science. So the art side would be, as a product leader and prior to that as a PM, I try to regularly talk to real customers every week, even if it's just 1 or 2, but keeping a regular pulse on the people using your product. And that can give you a sense for, is this something that is a real power user feature that only subscribers are going to be interested in? Or is it something that anybody would get value out of? The other question to ask too is, depending on how your product grows, you generally don't want to put features behind the paywall if they're critical to driving your organic acquisition loops. And so in the case of Quizlet, like, we didn't paywall content creation features for the most part because we wanted students and teachers to create sets, which were essentially digital flashcards, because those sets got indexed by Google and then drove SEO. And so if we were to put that behind the paywall, we would kill our SEO flywheel. So those are the 2 considerations I would think about. What are users willing to pay for versus what's kind of a nice to have, and then what will help drive organic acquisition versus what won't. If it's going to drive organic acquisition, don't put it behind the paywall. That's the art part of it. The science part of it is the conjoint analysis. I mean, that's where doing the conjoint analysis and actually measuring quantitatively the marginal willingness to pay for a particular feature is a really good way of knowing whether it's worth putting behind a paywall or not.
All right, we've got another question here, which is about introducing new plans. Other than introducing new plans, are there other innovative monetization methods you're seeing work? And this person is especially wondering how LLMs could make this even more interesting.
Sure. Well, in my mind, those are 2 largely separate questions. I'll address the first one, which is, outside of launching additional plans, can you improve monetization in other ways? So I want to separate tiers versus plans. There are subscription tiers like Tender Plus, Gold, Platinum, and then there are plan durations like monthly and annual, or in some cases, weekly or lifetime. For the most part, unless you're a very large business, you just want a single subscription tier. Having multiple subscription tiers is too complex for smaller consumer subscription companies because it's just too much complexity to manage, and it's too much for consumers to think about. Only once you get to like tender scale should you be thinking about multiple tiers. But having multiple subscription plans, meaning monthly versus annual, is a very good idea. There are lots of tactics you can use on your paywall and in your email communications to nudge users towards longer duration plans like annual plans, which tends to lead to higher LTVs, better long-term subscriber retention, and more revenue. There are strategic discounting strategies you can use. So one of my favorites is, if you know that 90% of your new users convert into subscribers or convert into a trial within their first 48 hours after installing the app, then hit any users who haven't converted in 48 hours with an email that offers them a 15 to 30% discount, and then route them from that email to a web-based checkout flow, which means you'll avoid the 15 to 30% app store fees. You'll end up net neutral on the revenue you get from that user, but you'll be able to convert them at higher rates because these are lower intent users who haven't already converted into subscribers in the first 48 hours. So there are clever things you can do to improve monetization without the really heavy-handed approach of launching like a second or a third subscription tier.
So we've got a question here related to the Van Westendorp and conjoint analysis, and it's all about sample size. how do you ensure that you have the right sample size for these types of analyses? And is the data even helpful if you have a smaller sample size?
Yeah, that I'm so glad you asked that because that is a really important question. If you run a survey with 50 people, chances are you're going to get some pretty inaccurate results, certainly on a conjoint, but even on a Van Westendorp. Um, I take the easy way, which is I use a tool called Conjointly to run all of my subscription surveys for the clients that I work with. You can also use Qualtrics, Momentive. There are plenty of great tools out there that will calculate the necessary sample size for you based on things like um, how many conjoint rounds am I going through? How many different packages am I showing each user? How many different features am I showing in each conjoint package? So that would be my recommendation is like invest in a tool like Conjointly or Qualtrics that allows you to do this out of the box so that you don't have to do all the math yourself. If you don't have the budget for that, there are tools out there where you can figure out the necessary sample size. It's just quite a bit more complex. Also, analyzing conjoint without a tool like the ones I described is pretty difficult. Van Westendorp's easier. You can manually do Van Westendorp, but that's much harder with conjoint analysis. So that'd be my recommendation. As a rule of thumb, like most of the subscription surveys I'm running, I'm doing sample sizes of like 300 to 400 respondents. But with the big caveat that like if you want to segment by country, or if you want to segment by people who are already paying for your subscription versus not, or if you have five different user personas and you want to segment willingness to pay across those personas, that's going to dramatically increase your necessary sample size.
Another question related to just how you run these analyses and how you run experiments or think about changes. Does running simulations help with regards to price or plan changes? This person has struggled with running effective simulations while trying to come up with price changes or even playing around with, say, annual versus monthly versus quarterly plans.
When this person says simulations, I mean, if they can clarify, then that would help. But otherwise, I'm going to assume they mean something like a Monte Carlo analysis or some sort of like simulated outcome of what different price points would lead to. I've seen one or two examples of Monte Carlo analysis used at companies that I've worked at in the past, but it's pretty unusual. In general, what I think works better is either just go run the A/B test in the product, which is ultimately the final acid test. But ideally, if you have the resources to do it, do a Van Westendorp and or conjoint analysis up front because it will give you a lot more nuanced understanding of like how willingness to pay varies by different user demographics or different personas or different geographies. And then it will help to inform what prices you actually want to test in your product. And it will also help to inform how you interpret the results of those price tests.
Now, let's zoom out a little bit. This person has a question about how do we decide if a subscription model is the right model to adopt? And they share an example. Let's say with dating sites, there could be an inherent conflict between what the business is trying to achieve versus customer lifetime value. Or in cases like video streaming, there's a tendency to use free streaming with ads to improve economics versus pure subscription. So how do you decide if subscription is the right model?
This is a great question and it's one, right? Because all in all, subscriptions are great because you can rely on money to keep coming in over time. But if that's fundamentally mismatched with how your customer experiences the value of your product, it's going to lead to problems. And I think Thumbtack is an example of where early on, Thumbtack tried to monetize their platform as a subscription, and it largely failed because you had a lot of homeowners who were only episodically using the product. And so they moved to a model where they were more monetizing based off of the leads that they were sending to the professionals. And so subscriptions don't always work. To me, the acid test for that is look at your core value promise. Like fundamentally, what is the value you are delivering to users? Is that value occurring frequently enough? And does it occur for long enough over the long run that a subscription model makes sense? And if the answer is yes, subscription can work. If the answer is no, you might want to look at other models. Now, there are cases like dating where even though a good number of your users are going to churn after the first 3, 4, 6 months, if you monetize them highly enough in those first 3 to 6 months, it may not matter, right? Because Bumble and Tinder get a lot of acquisition through free organic growth. And because they have multiple subscription tiers and in-app purchases that mean really high average revenue per subscriber, the business model still works really well. So that doesn't fundamentally mean you can't build a subscription business, even if your average subscriber lifetime is only 6 months. It just means it's harder.
So let's talk about the model a little bit more. Let's say we have a leaky bucket problem. Is there an opportunity for a business to reignite growth with the subscription model when there's a leaky bucket? How would you re-engage those users that have lost trust or interest in your product? And is it even worth it to try and re-engage those users,
Yeah.
or should you find new ones?
So I'll break that into two parts. There's reactivation and there's retention. Reactivation is something that is notoriously overestimated as a growth lever, because if you've been around long enough and if you have enough dormant or churn subscribers, the rationale is, wow, we've got thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of churn subscribers, right? If we can convert even 1% of them, that's like found money. Well, the reality is those are going to be among the hardest users to bring back into your product, right? They churn for a reason. It's going to take a lot to get them back in the door. Usually the best way to do it is if you've launched a brand new premium product or set of features, you tell them, hey, guess what? Our product has just fundamentally changed in ways that might interest you. That can be a good way to do it. But in general, I don't see a huge amount of impact from reactivation work. What I see a ton of impact on is huge amounts of effort put into long-term user and subscriber retention. And I know we're coming up on time here, so in the interest of time, I'll just point you to Jorge Mazal's post on Lenny's newsletter. That's how Duolingo reignited user growth. Is all about, they developed a growth model. They looked at which metrics within that growth model were most correlated with long-term user and subscriber revenue growth. And what they found was current user retention, meaning maximizing the retention of their existing DAUs who are already using the product, was the number one metric they should focus on to accelerate the growth of the business. And the post goes into a lot of great detail on how they went about that.
Great, Phil. Thank you so much. I know we're at time. Why don't you close us out?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to take 1 minute at the end here to publicize my course. So for those of you who like the webinar today, I do teach this Reforge course on consumer subscription growth. It's one of the top rated courses in the entire catalog. Net Promoter Score well over 70%. More than 200 members have taken it across some of the best tech companies in the business. You can see a few of those companies on this slide. So would love to have you. And the next cohort is starting in just 2 weeks. So we have our first live event on the morning of Tuesday, September 17th. But the first async review will start Tuesday, September 10th. Basically, the course runs for 4 weeks in week-long cycles. First week, we cover the subscription value loop as a framework, and then we do deep dives on value creation, value delivery, and value capture. And hopefully you've gotten a sneak peek today of what's covered in the course, but it's only the tip of the iceberg. So what the course goes into is a lot more case studies, a lot more specific tools and templates and tactics that will help you apply these lessons at your own company. And then we have these 4 amazing featured guest speakers, Ravi Mehta, who is the CPO at Tinder, Gina Gahilf, who led marketing and growth at Duolingo for several years, Yuri Temin, who led marketing and growth at Grammarly for 9 years, and then Jason Vandermew, who is still leading growth engineering at Strava. And so 4 great applied examples of how to use this framework to maximize the potential of your consumer subscription business. So if you're interested, would love to have you. Feel free to reach out to me anytime on LinkedIn if you have questions, or you can reach out to Reforge as well. And with that, I just wanted to end on a positive note. I think there was a little bit of like wet blanket, hey, consumer subscription is hard. But the way I look at it is it's fun being the underdog, right? When people underestimate you, that just means you have every opportunity to surprise them. And I think there are a number of things changing in the consumer subscription app ecosystem right now that are going to make it easier and easier for consumer subscriptions to have more of these breakout success stories. So hopefully some of these tools that I've talked about today help you beat the odds. And I'm looking forward to talking more.
Phenomenal. Love that ending note, Phil. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with everybody. We'll be sharing the slides and the recording with everyone that registered for the event. So be on the lookout. Otherwise, thank you all for joining. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone.